Welcome to Ecologic for the great month of May. Beautiful time of the year. Blackberries are ripe. In fact, I picked blackberries this afternoon, made a blackberry pie for a little gathering for my granddaughter's 8th grade graduation. So, beautiful time of the year. Wind's been blowing real hard. Fishing has not been real good. They're catching a lot of shrimp. Tonight's subject is coastal restoration. And I have with me Brent Logan, who has lived, hunted, fished in the marsh, I guess from Terrebonne to Cameron, and a lifetime of duck hunting and whatever in fishing in coastal zones. So we have watched the changes that have occurred. So we'll be talking about that. I was at Point last Sunday, I believe it was, and there were 69 cars and trailers at the Midpoint Landing. I thought, wow, all those cars at fishing must be great. Well, they weren't fishermen, they're all crawfish fishermen. It seems that a break has occurred over on the east side and allows river water into the swamp, and it's had phenomenal impact on crawfishing. Had one boat with 36 sacks. There was another boat with 101 sacks of crawfish. Now, each sack of crawfish is worth $60, $1.50 a pound. So in one day's catch, this one fisherman had $6,000 worth of crawfish. Nice. And I spoke to the couple that had 36 sacks. They've been catching for about 5 weeks. And the lowest they've had is 30 sacks, and the highest they've had was 62. So this is a phenomenal, this hadn't occurred in the basin probably in 10 years. So I guess it's one of those accidents of nature that has allowed water to circulate, good water, river water, to circulate back into deep swamps. And it's giving the crawfish a real bonanza. Just indicates how nature can respond very quickly when good water quality, good circulation comes about, and brings fantastic results. So, but anyway, coastal restoration and the effort to deal with coastal land loss goes back to, I guess, the middle 80s when Louisiana set up a program to actually do projects. And when Louisiana put some serious money into it, Congress responded, they came up with a program, and then that's the first Louisiana Coastal Restoration Program, which brings about 70 to 100 million dollars a year to the effort. And then during Governor Blanco's term in office, they set up the Louisiana Coastal Restoration Program, which is joint federal and state, but it really is administered by the state. And for the last, I guess, 5 years, their budget exceeds $1 billion. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we want to first talk about how the lands have been managed. And first you start off with one very important fact. The 6 million acres of coastal marshes and swamps that Louisiana has are tidal systems. And they've been working with the tide for thousands of years. And that tidal system was built and is nourished by the Mississippi River, which drains 34 states, parts of 4 Canadian provinces, everything between the Alleghenies and the Rockies, across the whole country, filters in one way or another through that whole marsh system. That's what built it. And there's an interesting LSU geologic study in the 60s that looked at the deposition throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And in 30,000 years, the average deposition in the Gulf is 30 feet. Louisiana's coastal zone, which roughly goes from Highway 190 to the continental shelf, the deposition in 30,000 years is 670 feet. So, in geologic terms, 30,000 years is a mere blink. And so this deposition from 34th State is in a process of consolidation. It is compressing, it's consolidating. So that gives us a natural subsidence that exceeds what the rest of the Gulf of Mexico is. And so that's something that nature has offset by, one, the continual flood and the deposition that comes from the riverine system, the Mississippi, the Atchafalaya, the Red. It's also offset by vegetation growth, and it's also offset by storms, high wind periods, as we've been experiencing for the last month or so, that kicks waves up into shallow bays, just puts mud in circulation in the water column, pushes up high tides, and that goes over the marsh. So the three things, riverine flood, high wind periods, distributing sediment from the bay bottoms, and the die-off of the plants, those three things have kept the whole system growing. So what has changed? One, for the material to get down the river, it has to be free to flow. Obstruction that is things like we've done on the Red River. We put 5 dams on the Red River, and that blocks virtually all the sediment coming down from New Mexico, Amarillo, that whole region, southern Oklahoma, all that drainage area of western Texas, all towards Amarillo, the Canadian River. All of that is blocked by the dams. The dams on the Ohio, 29 dams on Ohio, 22 on the Mississippi. And each of these forms a lake. Where you dam the river, it's no longer a river, it becomes a lake. And it fills and fills and fills. The dams on the Red River were completed in 1985. And with an average depth, navigation depth when they were completed at 25 feet. It is now less than 10 feet in a period of 35 years. Those pools have filled. They can no longer pass the flood. And they're spending $80 million now dredging a 12-foot channel for tugboats and gambling boats to make it to Shreveport. So a lot of things we've done. Brent's real familiar with the wildlife reserves and what we have done. You might share with us your experience at Rockefeller in one of these 3,500 acre impoundments.
Yeah, about 5 years ago, maybe 7, been a while, took a tour of Rockefeller to look around to see what the environment for mainly ducks. I'm a big duck hunter more than I am deer or anything else. And on that tour, we went around. I think the week before they had like 1,500 teal that died, and that was due to the water quality in the refuge, which
Poison water.
huh?
Poison water.
Poison water, yes, because they've done a lot of. Everybody's trying to fix the coast, and a lot of those things you might want to pass on because you're changing the natural flow. I think Harold, about at a meeting probably about 2 years ago, ran into one of the big land managers, and the guy said, "I'll be darned if Harold Shuffle is going to tell us how to manage the marsh. We've been doing it for 100 years." Well, the marsh was fine for 1,000 years. In 100 years, it's kind of been destroyed. So I would say that's not too good of a job. So there's a lot to be discussed, and it touches many facets of our environment. And you know, people that live in it and do it, boaters, crawfish. Harold and I said all the boards ought to be crawfishermen, shrimpers, catfishermen, crabbers, because they understand. They make their living
The
out
trappers.
of that water. Yeah, the trappers, they make their living out of that water, and it really matters to them. We have a lot of people that sit in offices, some have never been out there, and don't understand that. Well, yeah, it's a nice little project on paper, but it stalled killed the water, and the animals died. That's not helping anything. If you take a look at the South Pecan Island, they got a big lake down there. Has anybody ever thought that roads in Louisiana are dams? They are. They cut off. They shell packed them. They weren't there when the marsh was there 100 years ago. Yeah, they had ridges, but the roads weren't there, and so all those roads become a dam. Well, that holds back your water. There goes your quality of your water. There goes your quality of your marsh.
Yeah, and the marshes are tidal wetlands, which means they are flooded and they're dry. And a lot of those areas, they get water on them every day and they dry off every day. A low tide they drain and a high tide they flood. So that's kind of the definition of wetland. A wetland is wet and dry. And we, in our wildlife reserves, we've done this. We've done this all over the private lands. We've virtually dammed off every bayou there is out there with big, a lot of it is at coastal restoration expense, big dams, often earthen dams. And so when you dam up Bayou Boudreaux, that might drain 5,000 acres of marsh, it no longer is a wetland. It is a lake. And so you change the whole environment. And whether you dam a river in Montana or a bayou in Louisiana, the result is the same. You no longer have a bayou or river, you have a lake, which is an entirely different environment. It is no longer a wetland. And somebody ought to be mitigating this loss. And the wildlife reserves are the worst. Marsh Island has 40 dams. Every major waterway is dammed. There's no way that a shrimp, a juvenile speckled trout, juvenile redfish, menhaden, go down the list, can ever enter those marshes. The vegetation we lose, typically in a coastal marsh, you'll have about 300 different species of plants in a tidal marsh. Now, when you no longer have a tidal marsh, you lose 99% of the plant diversity. You're down to 5 or 6 plants that can survive in a lake. And none of those plants support waterfowl. And when you turn it into a lake, the decaying vegetation takes the oxygen out of that whole system immediately, within 24 hours. Then you have these extraordinarily high tides, not necessarily a hurricane like we had Friday when I was out. The parking lot in Intercoastal City had water all over it. That parking lot is about 6 foot elevation. And so these impoundments are overwhelmed by that with the saltiest of water. Then you've trapped it in a lake. And the only way it can leave is by evaporation, which increases salinity levels. The salt doesn't evaporate, it stays behind. So not only are you killing the plants because you're flooding them, but you're killing it with high salinities. We know that the conditions there to grow, for instance, frogs. A frog can live anywhere, but a tadpole has to have good water to survive, from an egg to a frog. And if that's not there, you don't have frogs. And a frog lives a year or two, so, you know, the canary in the mine is the marsh that has no frogs is a dead marsh. And we look at well-meaning groups like Ducks Unlimited. They spend millions putting in the Vermilion Parish, just east of the Barn Isle Road and west of Freshwater Bayou, and the Humboldt Canal to the south, Schooner Bayou to the north. about a 12,000 acre site. They put over 100 weirs, and these are little 2-foot flap gate weirs across into every bayou. And the bayou that once drained that marsh and allowed tidal exchange was totally closed. They put an earthen dam with a 2-foot pipe that only allows water out, no water in. Well, it's not long between the debris and stuff going through it. It jams the flap gate closed. So the whole thing is closed. And so you have an impounded marsh with no way to drain. And the only way it gets flood into it is by one of these super high tides like we had the last couple of days. And that's the saltiest of water. And then it's left behind. It's put into a big bowl. We can look at, when one of the landowners leased their land to a big mud company. Mud company, the first thing they did, there was about 5 or 6 bayous that drained this particular marsh south of Vermilion Bay. And they put a big houseboat, got all kinds of mud boats, built all kinds of fancy blinds, and they dammed every bayou into it. Well, Trapper Toops had trapped there for 30 years. And a year after they built the dams, trapping season was coming along. It was about October, November, and I saw Mr. Toops somewhere in Abbeville, and I said, "You gonna be trapping this year?" He said, "Oh, no." He says, the duck hunters have dammed off all the bayous, totally flooded the marsh. He said, all the muskrat are gone. That's my bread and butter. It killed all the three-cornered grass. And he says, all the fur trapping is over. He said, I've trapped there 30 years. And he said, I never thought I'd ever live to see that one of the best trapping grounds in Vermilion Parish would be totally destroyed. So the old trappers knew what was going on, and they had 38 trappers on Rockefeller Reserve, and this was shared with me by game warden Wade Benson, and he was one of those trappers, and he lived on Pecan Island, and he said when they started getting oil money, the first thing they did was dredge a canal completely around Rockefeller Reserve to define the boundaries. Well, that canal and the big spoil bank shut off all the bayous, shut off all the tidal exchange. The next year, 38 trappers left. There wasn't a trapper left on the Rockefeller Reserve because they had totally destroyed the tidal exchange, wiped out all the muskrat, nutria, and everything else that was living there. So, this goes back to one phenomenal mistake after another. You can go to Lacassine Reserve, and it's one. They built these 3,000 acre impoundments, and they built canals and roads. You can drive around. It's kind of pretty to drive on, but it's not marsh anymore. Shrimp can never come into it. Juvenile trout can never come into it. There's no, so you have the marsh that's no longer a wetland is a lake. And I don't know what it would take to cure this, a realization that wetland losses, if you turn a marsh into a lake, that should be mitigated as a wetland loss. We have a dam in Henderson owned by St. Martin Parish that blocks all the flow from Henderson. That's kind of important because when the flood comes, we want to dump the flood into Henderson. But we can dump it, but the gates of that unit hardly open. It's almost impossible to open. They're very poor repair. They keep them closed all the time. They keep Henderson at +10. And normally Henderson would go down to Chaffly River. It'd go down to 2 or 3. So by keeping it +10, you've destroyed thousands of acres of wetlands that's permanently flooded. No one is recognizing the importance of those wetlands. In a lake, you don't grow grass that would feed waterfowl, deer, rabbits, everything else living out there. When you submerge a wetland, you kill all the oak trees, all the trees that would grow acorns and food for squirrels and deer and wood ducks and all. You kill them all. That's the first ones to go. And so it's so important that we recognize, and it's all part of coastal restoration. The typical coastal restoration project, and there was one near Intercoastal City, there's 305 acres. They build a big levee around it. Then they go with these giant dredges out in the bay. They dredge these holes in the bay 30, 40 feet deep. Don't tell anybody where it is. The guy shrimping doesn't know where it is. And so you got this giant hole out there, which is very detrimental to the environment of the bay. The bay bottom is just as important as the marsh. That's where the clams and the worms and the grubs and the crabs and all these critters live. So to dig a hole 40 feet deep is total destruction of what they call the benthos, the critters that live in the bottom of the bay. And this project was 3 years ago, and it's pretty much, it was a big open lake, and in 3 years we spent $38 million, and it's all turned back to an open lake again. In that process, every little bayou opening into that, they put earthen dams, and then they armored it with rock on top of that, and to totally close the marsh off from any kind of inflow and outflow. And if the water from the flood in the high tides cannot get into the marsh, neither can the shrimp, neither can trout, neither can mullet. And if the tide can't go out, the millet and wild rice and portana and all these plants that feed ducks and so forth can't grow. And so, you got somewhere in this, somebody wants to blame oil companies for this marshland loss. I would start with the wildlife reserves and how they manage those. And you can go to the Sabine, you can go to the Rockefeller, you can go to Lacassee, you go to Cameron Prairies, look at an aerial picture, and when you see square lakes everywhere, you know the good Lord didn't make one square lake. That's all man's intervention to destroy coastal wetlands. And again, you look at the White Lake system. White Lake and Grand Lake, it goes from Middle Cameron Parish to almost to the eastern edge of the main parish. That's an impoundment. And they keep the water at +3, which means the marsh is always flooded. So this is one of the greatest duck hunting places on earth, and it's destroyed by this flood. And because it stays flooded, all the marsh plants, the marsh is just disappearing like crazy. And, I don't know how we wake up to this. I don't know what can be done about it.
Well, I remember when we were kids, today they got to keep the water high so they can get to their blinds. I remember in the old days, in the 60s and all, when the water would go out and you just have to hunt the canal because you're not going to get to in the middle of the pond. So those were experiences that are...
Then the area between Pequot and the Gulf, they've closed all the outlets to the Gulf. Now the Gulf is, when the high winds come, like it is now in the high tides, those rough seas have very turbid water, high levels of sediment, and that would push in towards the marsh and kind of bring sediment and keep the marsh from sinking. But we have the idea we have to stop saltwater intrusion, so we dam the whole thing off, and so the whole area from Pequot to the Gulf has become one giant lake. Places that cattle were grazing now are big lakes. You can see some of the cattle stalls and everything way out in the middle of the lake. You wonder why they were there. And part of it was they had a program where you could dredge free of charge. And so a lot of those pasture landowners, if they could extend their pastures way out into the marsh, they could do so by building a levee around it and then pumping it off. Well, when you pump water out of a hydric soil system, the consolidation is quick, very quick. And
Double or triple.
double or triple the normal subsidence. First thing you know, a year or two or three, and the whole thing's a big lake.
You have New Orleans.
Yep, New Orleans the same. They pump
Same
all the
thing,
water
just-
out from under New Orleans and it's sinking like a rock.
Yeah, just got cattle on
And,
it instead.
So we can look, I was in on a report where the director of the Louisiana Coastal Restoration, is called QUIPRA, gave a report on what's going on in the year 2021. They have 14 projects. 9 are marsh building projects. The one I described in coastal, they build a levee around an open lake, and then they pump mud into it and hope grass will grow. And there's no provision for the tide to come in and out, for shrimp to ever come in and out of the system. So 9 of those, they roughly around 40 million apiece, each are about 300 acres. They have, the 10th project is a big marsh nourishment where they hydraulic dredging, I guess part of the Mississippi, and dump it into about a 3,000 acre marsh area. That project is over $100 million. And the total, and they're doing 4 barrier islands restoration. That's where you put a big dredge, 5 or 6 miles offshore, and you dredge up the sandbars and try to build beaches with it, And generally, that's kind of a losing battle because the barrier, the sandbars out there, reduce wave impact to the shores. So if you remove the sandbars, you're going to have higher waves, high impact, and high erosion. So anyway, we're spending $1.1 billion the fiscal year 21-22. The total recovery is about 7,000 acres. Mr. Klein gave a report on the impact of Hurricane Ida, and with drones they surveyed marsh loss from the Mississippi to the Atchafalaya. And the results of that study showed they lost 134 square miles. That's 89,700 acres. That's the loss from one hurricane. And
Some good return for your dredging, huh?
right, and they lost 9 of their projects. Totally lost 9 of their marsh restoration projects in that zone. When you look at what's happening, not only the fact that we pretty much dammed off every river in the country, and it's hard to imagine how a river dammed up the Platte River, up in Nebraska, how that's going to affect Louisiana coastal zone, but it does. There's over 6,000 dams in the Mississippi tributary. You can go to Nebraska and Wyoming. You want a campground, just find a river, and every 50 miles you got a dam and a state park. So each of these is a negative for Louisiana's coastal zone. Some of the sediment studies show from 1900 to 2000, we've lost about 95% of the sediment coming down. And then the annual flow. One study from 1900 to 1990 showed that the annual flow down the Mississippi is reduced 50%. And so that fresh water is what nourishes the marshes and so forth. And there's a bunch of issues out there that shows the impact on the environment of what we're doing. And I guess one of the most notable, most famous of these impact issues is the tarpon, the Grand Isle tarpon rodeo, the New Orleans tarpon rodeo, the Cameron Tarpon Rodeo, the Intercoastal Tarpon Rodeo. They had several at Sycamore. The highest level of tarpon registration at any rodeo in the Gulf was the Intercoastal City Kiwanis Rodeo back in the early 70s, where I think they registered almost 200 tarpon. And so this was part of why Louisiana's called the sportsman's paradise. Now you can't find a tarpon anywhere from Cameron to the Mississippi. I think on one hand, you could count the number of tarpon that have been caught in Louisiana waters in the last 5 years. And why is that happening? Well, part of it is all the dams that we're building block the tarpon from running up the rivers. When I was growing up, we fished on the Chafly on the east side, on Grand Lake and Bayou Pigeon and Bayou Long. Well, July and August, that area was full of tarpon. Constantly looking, the water's pretty and green, beautiful, it flowed through the swamp, and you were looking at tarpon all the time. And they were spawning there. And tarpon don't move up and down the coast. They move like salmon. They spawn in the rivers, and where the juvenile stay in the swamp for a year after they're hatched, and then they go to sea. And they live about 80 years. So we build dams like the ones around White Lake, Grand Lake. So the swamps on the Mermentau, Blackman Brule, Bayou Nepake, giant swamps that were breeding grounds for tarpon, the door is totally closed. From 58 to 62, we dredged the big channel on the Chafly. And we wanted to force, the Corps' goal was to force as much as they could down the main channel and close off all outlets to the outside. So they dredged this channel 100 feet deep, 1,000 feet wide. They had 28 of the biggest dredges on earth operating for almost 5 years. And there was no control over the spawn. They closed all the side rivers, the Grand, the Crew Boat Chute, the Crevasse, you name all these. Every waterway that went from the main channel to the sides was closed. The Grand River was the worst. The Grand River was bigger than the Chafalaya, and they closed that one. And they closed it on both sides. The Grand River actually started at Butte La Rose. And the little Chafalaya was the Chafalaya around Island on the older maps. But they put a spoil bank across Grand Lake, and the spoil bank is like 10 or 12 feet, 15 feet or more above sea level. So that blocked all the movement of tarpon into the system. So one end of the state to the other, we closed off every waterway so the tarpon couldn't reproduce. It's kind of like the pelican. The pelican, it was poison that was affecting the thickness of eggs, but with tarpon, they can't reach their spawning ground. And so they live 75, 80 years. So it's not long. We don't have a New Orleans tarpon rodeo. We don't have a tarpon rodeo at, Cameron or at Intercoastal City or at Sycamore Point. They have fishing rodeos, but nowhere are they registering tarpon. I was talking to one of the guys fishing wildlife. He said, you ought to put a limit. I said, yeah, that's about like putting a limit on passenger pigeons. That's way too late to try to put limits. I don't know of anyone that's caught a tarpon in the last 25, 30 years. I understand that a fisherman with hoop nets right in the Whiskey Bay Channel caught one about 10, 20 pounds in a hoop net. And I hear that at Mud Point, somebody with a mud boat hit one and it went thrashing off into the marsh, and it was a tarpon of about 40, 50 pounds, probably very well lost. So the losses from this mismanagement are horrendous. And, you know, the wildlife reserves, both federal and state, have set the model for this destruction. I mean, Lacassine is a lake. And there's parts of Lacassine that they made it lakes with canals for whatever reason. They built roads around them, and that's the same with Cameron Parish, the same with Sabine, the same with Rockefeller. Marsh Island, you can't drive around, but every major bayou on it has a dam. And it's sad to see the losses that occur because of it. In 1985, Louisiana Wildlife Fisheries sold 38,700 commercial shrimping vessel licenses. 10 years later, in 95, they sold 10,200. In 2005, they sold less than 3,000. And I understand the last couple of years it's been about 1,500. But you can go to Delcom. Morgan City was a big shrimp port, probably had 10 ice houses, 8 or 10 packing houses for shrimp. All that's gone. You can look at Delcom. Used to have probably 300 shrimp boats at Delcom. They probably don't have 10 left. Intracoastal City has a few shrimp boats. I guess that's become more offshore shrimp import than Delcom. But it's unbelievable, the changes in the system, and mainly because we put dams all over it. There's a bayou on the south side of Vermilion Bayou. It's called Coles Bayou, I think is the name of it, and it drains the marsh north of the Chenier Rig, and it's a very healthy across Audubon Reserve, and it drains probably around 15,000 acres of marsh, about 10,000 acres of marsh. They just got through putting a dam on it. And that means you got 6,000 acres of marsh or 7,000 acres that can't produce a shrimp.
And would you tell our local politicians when they said, well, what about that dam and all that concrete they're putting?
You know,
Shrimp can't jump it.
that's right. I was with Clay Higgins inspecting this big project, and we stepped out of the boat onto a concrete dam that's about a half mile long on Freshwater Bayou. And I would guess it's about 4 feet above sea level, big concrete dam and he says, what do you think about this? Isn't this great? I said, well, a shrimp can't jump this dam. And I said, if shrimp can't get in, neither can the sediment, neither can the tide coming out. So all the plants that depend on tidal exchange for them to sprout in the spring, the seed germination temperatures are, for millet and wild rice and all that, is about 125 degrees. That only happens when those seeds are looking right at the sun during those last big low tides of February, March, and April. That's when the marsh sprouts and grows. But it's flooded all the time. And the marsh, the plants can't grow. And it affects things like oysters, clams. The decaying vegetation from all this plant life is what feeds the clams and the oysters and all that. And kind of important because crabs eat clams. So if you wipe out all the clams, your crab numbers are going to go down. About 5 years ago, there was an oyster kill that went from the Point of Fur all the way to Southwest Pass. And I had a little anchor. When you anchor on a reef, it would catch oysters. So I'd pull up these clusters of oysters, and they're all dead, freshly dead. I called Wildlife and Fisheries and said, wow, you got an oyster kill. And I said, if you kill the oysters, you're going to kill the clams. Well, we think it's some bacteria or something. I said, certainly it's worth investigating. I said, I have an idea that the dead water coming out of the Chaffly Basin, if the water's real calm and you don't have waves to aerate, this no oxygen water going to land on the clams and oysters and kill them all. They can survive in fresh water for 6 months, but they can't survive in zero oxygen water for 24 hours. So, the reason you look for the cause is perhaps it's something we can do nothing about. But if it is dead water coming from the basin, we have all kinds of control gates up there at Simmsport that we could control the drain, slow down the drain till get a little higher winds, and that would aerate, put oxygen in the water without it killing all the clams. And I said, look, if you kill all the clams, the price of crab's going to go out of sight. Well, the price of crabs went from 20 cents a pound to $2 a pound in about a year, 6 months. Because 2/3 of what crabs eat is clams. So if you kill all the clams, you're going to wipe out all the crabs. And it's all connected, all interconnected. So somewhere in this, you have parishes like Vermilion suing the oil companies. I don't know whether oil companies fit in this. And there are certainly some problems with the design of pipelines, the design of canals. That could have been, it should have been a lot better. But when you look at, it wasn't the oil field that screwed up Rockefeller. Oh, that's messing up Marshall, and that's messing up Lacassine Reserve. That's all poor design. A lack of understanding, the idea that we're going to manage this so that ducks have water to sit on when they come down, ignoring the fact they got to have something to eat, and that the same things that allow shrimp and all juvenile trout and all to grow, that's the same thing that allows plants to grow that feeds ducks. So it's all very much tied together. And so for those of us like Brett and I, we've watched this happen. And you might share with us what's happening on the Intercoastal near your duck lease over there on continental land.
Well, I hunted Pecan Island for years. My family had a camp there. Years ago, I moved to a camp down north of Houma, between Morgan City and Houma, in what they call Gibson. And the marsh was just outstanding. We had some very good hunting, and in a matter of about 30 years, it's gone from a great marsh to nothing but an open lake. A lot of that has to do with the controls, the modifications that were made, and people, they're well intended, don't get me wrong. It's just, for some reason, one of the wildlife guys he's actually from this area, is over there. He shows me, he says, here's the model, we're gonna put this concrete barrier on the south side, the intercoastal is gonna stop the erosion and all. I was in his office, I said, that's about 25 years ago, I said, it's not gonna work. And he said, well, it was engineered and all. In about a year, they have signs that say, warning, underwater obstruction.
The rock sunk.
The rock sunk, just like I told him they would. And then they come back and try to put hay bales to try and change it. But it's I said, this isn't a marsh you live on. You live in a clay kind of bottom marsh. This is vegetative. You get out the boat, you sink to China. So very soft, very different. I would say Louisiana probably has between 3 and 4 different marsh types, and depends on where you are, what type of marsh you're in. Some of it is destroyed very quickly. Doesn't take but a wind, a storm, some salt water the wrong way, some fresh water the wrong way.
That's all a freshwater marsh, Mm-hmm. It's always fresh from the Chaffly, and you think, well, salt water intrusion killing the marsh. It's not. It's flooding. You can look. Cameron, USGS did a 12-year study on Cameron Parish and came to the conclusion that only the marsh in Cameron Parish that survived is the tidal marshes.
In Cameron?
In Cameron. So you have the Sabine Reserve, the Cameron Parish Reserve, a whole list of reserve, and then the private landowners have levied off and dammed off and pumped off, and it's just amazing. Everything from the ridges to the Gulf is turned into open water. And, it's,
They claim sediment, but we're quite a ways away and quite a number of, what do you call them, cheniers or whatever between us and the Gulf.
yeah.
So salt water's not reaching us. It's the,
Well, they put rocks on freshwater bayou below Intercoastal City. And Brent and I, there was a little bayou right across from the canal that went right to the bay. And it became the major tidal exchange for about 4,000 acres of marsh. And we knew he was really functioning because you could always go in there and catch mullet and shrimp, and there was always bait with just a little bitty net. You could catch bait to catfish lines, So they put in rocks closing this thing off. We got a call. You on the air? Can we help you?
Hi, can you talk about what can be done to stop these destructive projects and to turn it around and improve these and just turn the situation around, please?
I think I think of this kind of like a triage. There's probably a third of the system is gone. It's not worth trying to fight to recovery. About a third of the system will recover no matter how much we screw it up or try to screw it up. And I'm thinking of the area west of the Chaffly and that marsh system going towards Burns Point. That's a very healthy system. And then a third of it, if we intervene, we can save it. And intervention mainly means opening up and allow the system to exchange with the tide. Like Marsh Island, every one of those dams should be removed immediately. If you take an issue like Pecan Island Road, that whole system, the whole White Lake, Grand Lake system should be opened up with bridges over portions of the marsh, because the water flows over the marsh and through it. And when you put a road, you dam the subterranean flow, which is very critical to water quality and so forth, for that water to move through the soil. Far as what they're doing now with barrier islands, that's a total waste of time. Those barrier islands were built by the mighty Mississippi that was draining the whole country, 34 states. The horrible farm practices of our breadbasket of the country contributed to building the barrier islands. Since the Civil War, we plowed up and destroyed and, cleared the forest to make farmland, and we're losing 30 tons or more of topsoil per year, per acre.
So Harold, the only way we can deal with this is if we go out midnight and take dynamite and bomb these dams?
ooh, yeah.
Well, man, if you were looking 100 years ago, there's a lot of people would be bringing that solution to the table. In fact, in Cameron Parish, they built a dam, I want to say it was on the Mermentau, and it flooded everybody so bad, and it flooded, that the people of the area got together with a lot of dynamite, just blew it up.
And realistically, how can we make it happen?
I don't know how, the best thing the coastal restoration people could happen would be to run out of money. You have good intentioned people like Ducks Unlimited that are contributing this. Ducks Unlimited spent about $2 million right in the area where I hunt, where they closed the bayous that they have rocks along it, and the bayous drain through the rocks. So you still have some, it's restricted, but you still have some tidal exchange in the marsh. But they come and close every one of those bayous with big dams, big enormous dams. behind the rocks, between the land and the rocks across the bayous, they dammed it up. And this is supposed
Is
to,
Mr. Logan a member of Ducks Unlimited?
this is the local Ducks Unlimited, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Can he comment on his, on that, can he comment on that, please?
Look,
Well, I mean, Brent was a big supporter of Ducks Unlimited, so Brent, share your thoughts with that.
well, I was probably a major contributor up to about 2015. I've since shut it down after seeing some of the stuff, and mainly to send a message, guys. You know, biology has to match up. They can do all the engineering, mud pumping they want, but somebody's got to step up and say the biology's not working, and they need to make it work. And what they've done is they've basically gone in and say, "Oh, I'll fix you a pond here." Well, a pond is probably detrimental because of the way it was done. It's supposed to be an exchange. My favorite part is actually the eastern side where the Corps is talking about spending $2 billion on 2 new diversions, which they already got 9. None of them have worked. They're like using a garden hose to put out a forest fire. It's not.
And we
gonna
got
work.
another call coming, let's see if we can get it. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
You on the air, can we help you? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm listening at today's topic, talking about, the ecosystem for all the waterways, the bayous, the marshlands, and everything that's going on. And I know, like me, as being a resident of the state of Louisiana and love everything that our culture and everything that our sports, the outdoor sports, what it offers everybody. And I know everybody's mad about the dams and everything that have been put in place. So what can we do to stop the new projects that are going forward that we know that will continue to harm our ecosystem, and at the same time come up with a system or a project that will eliminate the projects that have been put in place from the past to help get everything back together? How can we do that?
One of the things we look at doing is going to putting a bill before Congress that will set up a water management plan that will include flood, normal water, and fisheries restoration and waterfall habitat restoration. We would manage White Lake. For instance, shrimp, it's only 10 or 12 days that shrimp move at, very, very small juvenile into the marshes. Well, we know what that is. Up in Alaska, they know when the salmon are coming from the sea back, but we shouldn't have those gates open. We should allow a big system like White Lake to have tidal exchange. Let the waters go down in the spring so we can grow the food for ducks and so forth. We need desperately to restore the fisheries in the Chafly Basin, for instance, at Henderson. If we put a gate where Old Catawba went into the Chafly River at Krotz Springs, we could drain the flood with it, but also we could get water from the river, which is the best water to have, to flow across Henderson, let it out at by Army, in Lake Dotreve, Lake Falls Point. These things would make this area a fishing paradise. It would allow shrimp to reproduce in those marshes where they historically have done. We've closed the doors with the levee, so we have to put openings back into it. And the same of all the marsh. All these dams should be dynamited out. They should be taken out.
Harold and I talk frequently on this, and one of the things is to change the mindset. Change the mindset.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
If we dynamite the dams that have been put in place, what will that have? What effect would that have on the fishery in those areas where the dams have been put in place? Is there another way that we can do it? Because if we blow it up, it's all going to settle.
Okay.
A lot of that stuff needs to be removed, especially the concrete that y'all are talking about.
You see, the dams turned a marsh into, it's no longer a coastal wetland, it's a coastal lake. that can't produce shrimp, and it can't produce mullet, and juvenile speckled trout, and juvenile redfish, and menhaden, and frogs, and the whole list of critters that, you know, and so to restore the tidal exchange is the key, to restore that fisheries so tarpon can come from the Gulf to the marsh and into the swamps so that we can restore the tarpon fishery. So you're right on point that, you know, you can grow a crawfish crop in 6 weeks. You can grow shrimp in 90 days. But the water conditions have to right. If you get the right water conditions, all of that happens, and that's doable. So thanks a lot for your call, sir. That kind of concludes our program, Brent. Thank you a lot for coming in. Appreciate it. Thank you, folks, for calling in. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
15 seconds.
That was great. We got a couple of good calls, and, you know, people realize, you know, this is something that can be fixed.
Yeah.
Not totally, but can be.
Yeah, well, they
fixed.
want a solution, but they,
5 seconds.
Yep. Thank you, Brent, for being.
you're welcome.